All right, well, welcome everybody. I know we're just getting started. Hi, Emily, welcome. So good afternoon, everybody. This is a community land trust workshop. My name is Yarrow Brown, and I am the Executive Director of Housing North. We're really excited to bring this workshop here to you today. It's a huge topic of conversation in our housing arena, but it's also about a new tool and an opportunity to bring housing to our region that locks in affordability long-term. Tomorrow, I just want to let you know we have a state land bank webinar with Jim Tischler. It's hosted by Leelanau County, but it's open to everybody. And it also connects to this topic. So please join us if you can, and you can find out how to sign up for that on our website. We're very fortunate to have 4 speakers with us today to discuss seasonal workforce housing and a potential solution in our region, not just seasonal workforce housing, to talk about housing in general. So we have Denny Sturdivant. He's a retired CEO for Dwelling Place of Grand Rapids, which is a nonprofit housing corporation. And he's gonna go over the basics of community land trusts. Denny was at Dwelling Place for 32 years, and under his leadership and direction, they has become one of the largest and most successful nonprofit housing developers in the state of Michigan. And under his leadership, they also created a community land trust. We also have George Larimore, who is from Colliers International, and he's gonna go over a sample financial modeling plan for Traverse City. George is involved in virtually every arena of the real estate industry and is a recognized expert in structured transactions through the use of various rehabilitation and other incentives programs. And maybe he can explain what that means to me at some point. He does extensive volunteer work on boards and committees for several other nonprofit organizations. Welcome, George. And then we have Larry Mobby from Peninsula Housing, and he's going to moderate the Q&A at the end. Larry's the founding winemaker for El Mobby Vineyards and the founder of Peninsula Housing, and he's also a community advocate who lives in Suttons Bay, Michigan. And then Emily Dorr is here, so we'll have her, she's from the State Land Bank, and Denny will bring her in during his conversation to say a few words about the State Land Bank and this tool. So thank you all for being here, for your willingness to share your experience and work in our region today. Since we have so many people in attendance, we made this into a webinar today, but we will have time for Q&A, and we should be able to use the chat function as well to communicate with each other. If for some reason we can't get to all the questions, we're committed to sending up a follow-up email, and we also created a page on our website with some community land trust resources. So thank you again, and I'm going to turn it over to Denny to kick it off with us, or us.
Thanks, Yarrow. Really appreciate it, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to my colleagues here on the call too, to Emily and George and Larry and Yarrow for helping with this, and can make it a lot easier and probably a lot more informative than if I were just doing it by myself. But as Yarrow mentioned, I became involved with about 20 years ago with CLT work. Looking at the possibilities in Michigan. Michigan is not known as a CLT state yet. Other states have taken this to a whole new level. Michigan is just in the process of starting to expand this idea. In fact, it's, I think, catching on in a number of areas. It's hard to do and hard to start up, but once you get it going, it can really make a powerful difference in your communities. The state of Michigan, in fact, in the Michigan Poverty Task Force report, which came out last year in 2021, has as one of its recommendations, recommendation number 24, the expansion of community land trusts in Michigan, because of the impact that it can have on ALICE families. Those are families, asset limited, income constrained, employed families, on wealth building for them, people who would otherwise, families that would otherwise not be able to afford their own home. And then also as a racial equity tool to be able to address wealth building there. I mean, I'm not sure how many people are aware, but you know, the home ownership rate in the United States for whites is about 73%. For blacks, it's just over half of that, in 40% range. Michigan is not much different than that. And that's also true of other minority groups in Michigan. So the racial inequities we see, one of the ways to address that is through creating some wealth building tools that will work for families who otherwise might not be able to afford a conventional mortgage. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to go through some organizational structure information about CLTs. I don't hold myself out as a decades-long expert. We have other people around, I think, that could make that claim. I think we have a couple people from Grounded Solutions on the call today that are experts on this too, and been involved with CLTs over across the United States. But I do know where to go and who to talk to get expertise. So I've done a lot of that over the last 3 or 4 years in helping to create, before I retired, a CLT dwelling place, which is just in the process of making some sales and growing. But my goal right now as a retiree is to spend some volunteer time to try to plant seeds across the state and maybe get involved, as I have always been involved, in some advocacy and public policy arena to make CLTs easier to do in the state of Michigan. So when I started this, I asked George, who's going to talk to you in a few minutes about the financial model, to help create a model for community land trusts that maybe could be scalable instead of one house at a time, which is often how CLTs have gotten started, is one house at a time. And this new model, the model we're trying to propose and promote, and Dwelling Place is actually trying to pioneer right now, it imagines using brownfield TIF, something that's been around in the state of Michigan for a long time, and working collectively with the brownfield authorities and the land banks to make that happen. So that's what George is going to be talking about when he gets in here, but I will share my screen now and talk a little bit about the basics. I'm going to be fairly quick and brief about this because the information I'm about to share is available in a lot of different locations, and Yarrow's going to have it available on her website as well, including the PowerPoint. So here goes. Okay. Okay. I am now screen sharing. And so these are actually 3 homes at Dwelling Place zones that are in the process of being converted into community land trust units. George, I'll make this presentation. Okay, what is going on? Excuse me just a second, it's a technical issue here. I'm trying to, there it goes. This screen here, not sure, it looks like it's you can't see the whole, can you see the whole screen? Can everyone see the whole screen? I'm not sure, it's housing gaps, but in any case, this screen is sort of gives you a firm grasp on the obvious of what happens with in communities like Traverse City and around Leland and Northwest Michigan, all over the United States, in fact, when affordability problems are created. You have what we call an affordable housing price, which gradually goes up over time based on incomes in communities. And then you have the market rate price of homes and that go up, that often, in fact, pretty much always are exceeding the affordable housing price. So what you end up with then is a gap, and that gap continues to grow unless somebody does something. Does something with it. Let's see. And that's called the affordability gap. So that's what happens the first time when an affordable home is put up for sale. A lot of philanthropy, public funds go into it to purchase land, to build a home, or to acquire an existing home to rehabilitate it. And then the next time you want to do this in a few years, because there aren't really any provisions in most cases where the original dollars that went into the home can be collected or preserved. That cost to the public, the cost for philanthropic dollars, the cost for public funding, the cost for land and construction has gone up. So the gap just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the purpose of community land trusts is to try to make a dent in this dilemma. So the goal that all of you have, and I think all of us have here, is how to make housing affordable and keep it affordable over time. We also want to prevent unwanted displacement of limited income households from the communities in where people live. And so the question we really want to ask, how do we protect and leverage limited public and private subsidies invested to create affordable housing? And oh, by the way, the house on here, I want to just mention a shout out to Jane McKenzie at Northern Homes. I've used a few of her homes in here, also a couple of Dwelling Place properties. So shout out to both of those groups for the work that they've been doing with community land trust for, in Northern Homes case, a long time. So the traditional homeownership programs that we kind of all are familiar with, often the assistance, and this isn't always the case, but often the assistance is provided to a limited income home buyer to bridge the affordability gap or the value gap or both. And it comes in often as a grant to a home buyer or a forgivable or deferred loan to the home buyer. There aren't, in most cases, any long-term protections put in place to preserve the initial affordability assistance that provided over time. That's that dilemma I talk about, that every time you do this over and over again, it gets more and more expensive. You could say this is really good for the first-time home buyer, but it really doesn't help the community to keep the home affordable on a long-term basis. Ongoing support and assistance to homeowners post-sales and after move-in is sometimes limited in time and sometimes not available at all. That's another distinction, I think, with a community land trust, because stewardship and long-term engagement with homeowners is part and parcel of what a community land trust does. It is. So the goal of a community land trust is to preserve housing affordability for home ownership in perpetuity as a wealth building tool, but to keep it affordable. It's often referred to as shared equity housing because you're sharing some of the appreciation gets shared between the homeowner, the home buyer, and the CLT to ensure affordability. It leverages and protects affordability subsidies that might come in from the private sector or the public sector on a permanent basis. It also, CLTs, because of that stewardship component, help homeowners to become and remain successful as homeowners. And then it also, for the communities, it stabilizes the communities by ensuring that housing quality and preventing displacement in the community. Community land trusts take a long-term, unique kind of long-term approach to affordable home ownership by altering how property ownership is structured. It's not the traditional way because you're splitting up ownership of the land from the improvements or the home. It also changes how the affordability subsidy is applied and how the long-term relationships with homeowners and tenants, and yes, I say tenants because in some cases CLTs actually own rental homes as well, are nurtured and maintained. CLTs are generally formed as community-based nonprofit corporations, or they're formed in close affiliation with an existing one. That's how we originally formed Dwelling Places Regional Community Land Trust. It's actually a wholly owned subsidiary right now of Dwelling Place, even though it's separately incorporated. And I'm going to go into a little bit about how that gets structured to make sure we don't lose the big C, the community piece in Community Land Trust, because it's owned by another organization or it's a wholly owned subsidiary. Having it as a 501c3 allows it to qualify through the IRS for tax exempt status as a 501c3 charitable organization. Also makes it eligible then to solicit philanthropic support for what it's doing. Traditional CLTs, and they're all different. And I want to say this, make it clear that there's not one particular approach, but there's sort of the classic CLT, the traditional CLT, which usually operates under a three-part governance structure with board representation from CLT owners as well as funders in the community. So in the case of Dwelling Place, in the case of many CLTs, persons who own the home, CLT homes, once you start having sales, you build that part of the board. And leasing, they own the homes, but they're leasing the land under the homes. The community, this is where you can bring in people, anyone you want. It could be realtors, it could be fair housing centers, it could be people who live in the neighborhood, it could be anybody, but that serves as the other third of that board. And then finally, a third of the board representing some of the public and private funder representatives to keep them engaged as well on the CLT board. And again, as I mentioned, it isn't always done the same way everywhere. And so what I'm describing is more of a traditional classic CLT. Dwelling Place, by the way, worked with a national consultant over 2 years to put the program together. Michael Brown, who's with Burlington Associates, did most of the consulting work with Dwelling Place in the formation of its CLT. So I talked about dual ownership. And dual ownership means that the improvements are purchased and owned by an individual, or in the case of it's a condominium, a corporate entity. But that dual ownership means the improvements, what's on top of the land, is owned by the CLT buyer. The CLT retains ownership of the land. The CLT then leases the land through a long-term lease, often 99 years, but not always, to the owner of the CLT improvements. The CLT controls future use and disposition of the land and improvements through that lease. So there's provisions within the land lease that help to define a lot of the terms in the legal obligations and responsibilities in the CLT. So the home is owned, again, by the buyer, the CLT buyer. The land is owned by the CLT. And then there's a lease between the two parties. So the ground lease itself serves a twofold function. One is it legally conveys to the homeowner an exclusive long-term right to use and occupy the land. CLTs in most cases, in fact, in every case, I believe, but these are inheritable. You can give them to your children, whatever. They come with virtually the same bundle of rights as traditional homeownership, except for those that affect affordability. So the lease defines the CLT's expectation of the homeowner, but also the homeowner's expectations of the CLT as well. And that's done by stipulating restrictions on the homeowner's use and occupancy, and how the home is transferred if there's ever a sale in the home. So some of those lease restrictions related to occupancy include one, that it be owner occupied. It's not for Airbnb. This isn't an Airbnb program. So it can't be sublet. Under use, there has to be a use that's consistent with zoning for wherever the home or the housing unit is. There has to be care and maintenance by the home buyer on the unit. And that's where the long-term stewardship part comes in, and making sure that that they're able to do that, and if they can't, that they can get help to help them to do that, and that they are responsible in the way they use and obey all the laws, ordinance, codes, etc., that come along with the home. Now, the subsidies actually used. I talk about a capital subsidy in CLTs. It's one of the, if you're going to bake a cake, and there were going to be a couple of necessary ingredients to make it come out right. In the model that we're talking about, the version that we're talking about with Brownfield TIF, it's absolutely essential that you've got to have some kind of a subsidy in place to be able to write down the cost of the home to the place where it's affordable for the home buyer. Now, in most cases, but not all, that's usually a number around 75% of the home's appraised value. If you're building a home, if the CLT is building a home in a neighborhood where the cost to build the home, the development costs, exceeds the appraised value of the home after it's built, then you even have a bigger subsidy you've got to be able to bring to the table to cover the cost here, to keep it affordable. In some cases, and in fact, this actually happens in many cases over time with CLTs, is the homes actually become even more and more affordable over time, so that as the market rate or appreciation in houses goes up, but incomes don't quite move quite as fast, because of the fact that the CLT is retaining some of the equity, the shared appreciation from the appreciation, they're able to actually come back to the next buyer and drop that from maybe 75% of its appraised value to 65% or 70% of its appraised value at the time of resale. So that's one of the features in the CLT that makes it really unique. And as that affordability increases, it also makes it possible for the CLT, because they're capturing 75% of the appreciation on the property, it allows the CLT to be able to get, if there's necessary repairs that they need to have done before resale, or if they want to charge a development fee for the CLT to help with making the CLT more sustainable. So, but generally the sale price is we're talking about a 75% of appraised value. And I'll mention dwelling place again, because one of the things that they are doing is actually dropping the price even lower, because they're renting some they're doing some rental conversions, converting some rental housing that dwelling place has owned for years with very little debt left on it into CLT units. And because there's so much equity for dwelling place in it, they're able to do the repairs and all and still sell the home at less than 75% of the appraised value. So by signing the ground lease, the CLT owner agrees to share with future homeowners the affordability that was initially created for them. And also, I just want to reiterate here that if someone could buy a home on a market rate basis, they should. We aren't here to say this is the end all be all or the panacea for all home ownership models. This is really for folks who might otherwise be renters or have a difficult time qualifying for a traditional market rate home. So to get to that point and that benefit, and because we want to keep this affordable in perpetuity, they agree to share with future homeowners the affordability that was initially created for them. They agree to a resale formula that will be used to determine the price at which they can sell their homes. And the public and the private affordability subsidies get preserved for the long haul for future home buyers in the community. So here's an example. George is going to go into a more detailed example, but I'm just going to show you an example. If an original value of the home based on appraisals is $250,000, and you're going to sell it for 25% discount or 75% of that appraised value, you're going to reduce that price by $62,500. So now the affordable home price becomes $187,500. Under the resale formula, the first buyer who buys that home at $187,500, when they decide to sell, the seller will be able to recoup equity, that is principal that they paid on their mortgage, plus their down payment if they had any down payments that they put in there, plus 25% of the appreciation that occurred from the time that they purchased the unit to the time it's resold and appraised again. 25%, not 100%. That's traditional market rate appreciation. And in the case of a CLT, it's 25%. Now, again, that 25% can vary too. Some might be a little less, some might be a little more. It just really depends on the CLT and the market you're in. But 25% is kind of the traditional formula that's used in these things. The appreciation retained by the CLT, that is the 75% of the appreciation, can be used for repairs. It can be used to charge a development fee, and or it can create even a larger sales discount to the next buyer. So they could sell it at 65% or 60% of its appraised value. Some would say, why would you want to give away that much equity? And well, partly it's to reach a lower income household to help them to become a homeowner. But keep in mind, you're not giving it away because the CLT buyer is only going to get back what they originally put in plus future appreciation. So it's not like you're giving anything away by discounting it further if you're capable, if your CLT is able to do that. So assuming a resale in 7 years, and by the way, 7 years is about the, for CLTs nationally, is about the average of a CLT homeowner before they do a resale. I looked at Traverse City area and it looked to me like the last 10 years, the appreciation on homes was about 6.6% per year from what I saw in this data I saw. So I put a 6% annual appreciation in the market in this, and the appraised value that at the end of 7 years would be $380,000. The CLT would recoup their principal, the CLT seller would recoup principal payments and down payment plus 25% of the appreciation on that increased value. So 25% of that increased value, which is $130,092, is $32,523. So the resale price for them, that would mean the resale price to the next buyer could be as low as $220,000, which is the original sales price plus the seller's appreciation that had to be paid out. Or stated differently, 58% of the appraised value plus the cost of any needed repairs or fees charged by the CLT. Another unique feature in a CLT is the requirement, really, or the model that outlines stewardship, that the CLT lays out these clear expectations for the owner, and while monitoring and enforcing compliance. A lot of times the CLT fees, the stewardship or land lease fees, are fairly nominal, $25, $50, sometimes $100, but they're fairly nominal, and they're sort of the canary in the coal mine fees that if something goes wrong there and they're not paying the fees, it really is a sign there may be some other things going on that you need to get your arms around and help them. The CLT enters into a long-term mutually accountable relationship with a homeowner, and the CLT stands behind and backstops its homeowners to ensure their success. If they get into trouble, they work with them to help them to stay as homeowners. In fact, in other parts of the country, some CLTs are actually buying units in foreclosure to help keep the owner in the home, and then putting the home that was in foreclosure would have been lost into a CLT type of ownership. Community outcomes that are, I think, really important. They should be important everywhere in Northwest Michigan, just like they are everywhere else in the United States. In the case of CLTs, most of the data shows that over 90% of CLT owners remain in their CLT purchased home for at least 5 years. Historically, the average tenure of CLT homeowners or sales or resales is about every 7 years. And studies have shown that more than 70% of CLT homeowners who do eventually sell their homes will purchase a market rate home using the equity they've created when they were CLT owners. This is another interesting little feature here, a fact that came from a 2019 study that the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy did. And you can see in terms of total loans during that recession period, 2008, 2009, 2010, the number of serious delinquencies was pretty high, according to the Mortgage Bankers Association. The number of CLT units that were in serious delinquency was, you can see down here, 1.98%, 1.62%, 1.3%, and it's even lower in foreclosures. The amount of foreclosures in 2008, 2019, 10 versus CLT foreclosures, which were less than 1% in all cases. That has a lot to do with the way a CLT is built and structured and the stewardship component in a CLT. So some of the outcomes that we see here with the subsidy leveraging is that CLT homes can remain affordable over time from homeowner to homeowner without requiring any additional public or private subsidy. The one-time public and private resources that are invested to create the initial housing affordability is preserved and leveraged over time as a wealth building tool for each subsequent CLT owner. And the community creates a permanent inventory of affordable home ownership opportunities that just continues to grow with the CLT to address workforce housing needs. I mentioned earlier that there are some examples where CLTs are actually quite involved with commercial properties, leasing the first floor in a mixed-use building, for example. This is a picture of a dwelling place property that actually is a commercial condo that they're in the process of converting the rental units up above into home ownership units, CLT home ownership units. This is my last slide. As I mentioned, I wanted to just give you a taste of this. I'm planting seeds. I'm willing to spend some time working with organizations that are really interested in this or have capacity to see where the next steps might be if they're interested in doing this. I also want to acknowledge some of the folks that I use some of their information in putting this together. Michael Brown, of course, of Burlington Associates, and George, who's going to be doing the next part of this presentation. Dwelling Place of Grand Rapids, which I had three or 4 years there working on a specific CLT formation that was my learning curve on a lot of this. But again, my interest in this goes back to 2002 and some involvement with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority in looking at CLTs in Michigan. NeighborWorks of America has been a big proponent of the development of CLTs through their shared equity initiative nationally. There are 8 NeighborWorks affiliates working in Michigan, and several of them, a number of them actually, have agreed to look at putting together a collaboration across the state geographically, with community land trust as one component of that collaboration. So I'm hoping to maybe work with some of those groups that most of these neighborhood affiliates have high capacity to be able to do a lot of great work. So hoping to work with some of them that are interested maybe in doing their own CLT or collaborating with a CLT that's forming to provide them with the capacity they need to make it work. And then the Michigan State Land Bank, Emily is going to say a few words. Doer, who's the director of the Michigan State Land Bank, after George is done, about the role of land banks and brownfield authorities in the model George is going to be talking about. And want to thank Euro again, Housing North and Grounded Solutions for a lot of the work that they've done over the years nationally. And to Larry for his passion in creating Peninsula Housing and moving that forward. I will be around here for questions afterwards, but my part was to basically give you a taste of what a CLT is and how it's structured and organized. So I will turn it now, I will stop sharing and turn it over to George.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Denny, for the introduction and all the valuable information. My name is George Larimore. As Cheryl said, I'm an incentive expert out of Grand Rapids dealing with primary housing. Been in the business for about 42 years now. I don't know why I haven't quit, but I haven't. So way back when, I guess maybe 3 years ago now, Denny did, because of the work I do with Dwelling Place in the past, it basically charged me with the idea of finding a funding mechanism that could, one, be used for CLT housing throughout the state without any real big problems. And the real kicker was, does not require any new legislation. So it became a little bit of a challenge, but not too bad. In this whole process, I befriended a guy by the name of Jim Tischler, who I think is going to be up there and having a webinar tomorrow, and Emily Gore at the Land Bank. In between Jim and I and Emily and a bunch of other people, I think we've come up with a good, solid model to fund part, if not all, of the funding gap. And that's what Jenny hinted at, saying we need a public subsidy in here somehow or other. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, is basically the use of land bank authorities, brownfield redevelopment authorities to fund the funding gap. Okay. It worked. I'm glad. I just introduced it, so I guess I can. I'm not going to try and make anybody an expert on land banks, brownfield redevelopment authority, or monetizing brownfield TIFs, but I'm going to give you hopefully a primer and a good understanding of how the tool can be used. To do this, I'm using a model that's throughout what I'm talking about. I'm going to use these assumptions that basically, and it's a model of 20 units. So I have it both per unit and in total. The model starts with $275,000 per unit development cost. That's all in, land, everything. The fair market value is $250. The selling price will be $187,500, which is 75% of the fair market value. For our TIF calculations in the development of the home, we're going to assume that there's going to be 30 grand worth of other TIF eligible expenditures, and that the base taxable value of the property is $100,000 or $5,000 a unit. Those are the assumptions. I'll try and go slow and not jump too far ahead with you on the assumptions. Start with the basics. Basically, your funding gap, what is it? It's the difference between your total development cost and the selling price of the home to the CLT buyer. For the whole 20 units, you can see we're going to develop the homes for $5.5 million. We're going to sell the homes for $3.75 million. That gives us a $1.75 million funding gap. What we've found is using a combination of brownfield redevelopment authorities and land banks. Doesn't have to be the state land bank, it can be a local. Excuse me. Goes a long way. In some places, actually covers the entire gap. You know, what is brownfield tax increment financing? Is very simple. It's when you do very simple. Probably shouldn't have said that. But when you do a development like this, you're going to increase the taxable value of the property. You start out with a piece of land, no roads, no nothing. You wind up with a subdevelopment. There's a tremendous uptick in the value of the land. That uptick in the value of the land creates an incremental increase in taxes, and brownfield TIF funding, if you would, or financing is basically capturing that increment that was created by your project and using it to help pay for the development costs. Very simplified. Anybody who's on this program that belongs to or works with the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority knows that I really just simplified it a whole bunch. But this is kind of our schedule, or what we're looking at with our example, where we have $2.5 million is their state taxable value. That's half the fair market value. You have the base taxable value of 100,000. So you created a tax equal increment in value of 2.4 million. I don't know for sure, but it appears that in Traverse City Public Schools, the millage rates about and I better back this up too, the non-school millage rate is about 31 mils. So when we're all said and done, we're going to create additional taxes in the community of $74,400 a year. Brownfield redevelopment authorities are allowed to take 10% of the increment for their use, and there's some other limitations that go in there. So in my example, I said take the 10%, so we're at 67,000, and I don't have to round too much anymore. You know, what are TIF eligible expenditures? I'm not going to go through this. There's a difference between non-core communities and core communities. There's the non-core communities center their TIF eligible expenditures based on more remediation work, you know, demolition, underground storage tank removal, those types of things. A core community basically does everything a non-core community, but can also get reimbursed for public infrastructure. I love this: vertically integrated parking, urban stormwater system, retaining walls, those types of things. The exciting part of all this is the land bank. The land bank gets the core community, which is also the non-core community. And they also have a provision where a land bank can obtain through the brownfield TIF assistance in selling or otherwise conveying the property to the ultimate owner. That phrase right there is extremely, extremely important. That link I have there is if anybody wants to become an expert on brownfield TIFs and a few other things, that's a MEDC publication, and it would be a good place to start. Special role for the land bank. I was telling you that the land bank has this provision in it under 381 where they can provide, the land bank can provide assistance for selling or otherwise conveying the property to a future owner. We just named it repositioning cost, for probably a lack of a better name. To qualify to use the repositioning cost as part of your TIF eligible expenditures, you have to have the land bank involved in your project, and your land bank has to have an interest in the property. That is, there's about 4 ways in which that can happen. They're interesting. It doesn't mean that you have to hand your property lock, stock, and barrel over to the land bank and then take it back when the land bank's done with it. There's ways involved in it. And basically repositioning costs are the costs associated with getting the property ready to sell, including in a CLT home, the difference between the total development cost and the selling price. That 87.5 discount that Denny was talking about with his CLT. These benefits are only available through a Brownfield Redevelopment Authority with land bank property that a land bank has an interest in. A Brownfield Redevelopment Authority can't do it on its own. A land bank can't do it on its own. It takes cooperation between the two to get it done. Calculating repositioning costs and other land bank considerations. Just go back to my assumptions. Total development price cost $5.5 million, 3.75 of sale proceeds, and then I threw in $100,000 of selling expenses, title transfers, deeds, transfer taxes, fees to the land bank, a few other things. So in our model, we have a gap between the sale price and the cost of doing this thing of $1.85 million. The land bank, the big thing is this whole consideration of repositioning costs, but the land bank can do other things for you too, a whole lot of other things. One of the things is that land bank involved property, if it's owned over the end of the year, the SEV gets reset to 0. So I started out with $100,000 value of the land, just the raw land. It can be reset to 0, and in raw land calculation, it's probably not a big deal. And it's there. People don't generally like to do it. The Brownfield Redevelopment or the land bank involvement in the property causes it to be qualified as a brownfield. So, and again, this is stretching things and a little aggressive, but it's in accordance with the law. You could literally have a perfectly clean piece of land that winds up in the land bank with land bank involvement that becomes qualified as a brownfield because under definition, land bank properties are blighted. The other thing the Brownfield Authority is allows core community eligible expenditures in non-core communities. So if you go back to my list there, there's a whole lot more you can get reimbursed from in the TIF in a core community than a non-core community, and that the land bank helps you with that. And then there's a 50-50 waiver, and basically what happens is when you set up one of these TIFs, the land bank authority gets to keep 50% of the TIF for the first 5 years. The land bank can waive that. And right now, Jim, Emily, and I are working, Jeremy and Denny, I think, is involved in this somewhere along the line, on a kind of a policy for what happens when a community land trust comes in to develop affordable homeownership housing. There'll be more to come on that. Like I said, it's a work in process right now. And people need to remember with the 50-50 waiver, the Brownfield or your land bank redevelopment authority generally has no real source of funds except that's been appropriated to them from the legislative body. This 550 TIF that they get is their only potential source of income. And so what we've been working on is a waiver of the 550 in lieu of a fee, an upfront fee to to the land bank. So the land bank is still there and prospers, and you're not giving away 50% of your TIF. What are TIF eligible expenditures? Site work. In a subdevelopment, you basically have site work, sewer, water, roads, sidewalk, anything, pretty much anything that's in the private or public right of way. Those are the things you look for in a subdevelopment. In addition, you get the repositioning cost. And so in my little example here, I have 1.85 million in repositioning cost, in 600 grand in other TIF eligible expenditures. So my entire TIF can be $2.45 million. Now, the law allows you see their interest, question mark. The law allows the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority to pay the developer interest on the Brownfield TIF. Most Brownfield authorities have said, well, the law allows us to, the law doesn't require us to, and we don't want to. It's a way to maximize your TIF value, just in case your eligible expenditures are less than your tax increment. But quite truthfully, in most of the deals I've been looking at, that's not happening. Just isn't happening. That repositioning cost really sucks up the TIF stream. You have your, you go through all that formula, go back, you calculate you go back and calculate your TIF, figure out what your TIF eligible expenditures are. Then you say, okay, what's the maximum I can do? Well, under the formula that's used for Brownfield Development Authority, the tax increment captured under our example here, 20 homes at $250 each, the increment's $2,388,000, and surprise, surprise, eligible expenditures are more than that. And so the most you can have is the $2,388,000. The TIF can last for 30 years. These numbers also assume, by the way, that there's a 1.5 annual increase in state taxable value, which has been true for about 20 years, maybe even longer, except for 2021, where it's probably going to be increasing by 5%. So that's your TIF stream. One of the problems that you have with the TIF is that it's collecting the incremental increase in taxes that your development causes over a 30-year period. To be able to develop this housing project, you need the money up front. And so you need to go through a process called monetization of the TIF stream. It's basically nothing more than borrowing money against the TIF stream and getting the proceeds up front. I'm not going to go into a lot of details with it. I'll tell you that it is not a traditional form of banking. So you probably, if you want to do a CLT in a 20-unit development, you probably shouldn't walk into your favorite neighborhood banker and say, hey, I've got this TIF reimbursement agreement. How about loaning me $1.8 million or 2.4 or whatever it is? And you probably will look at you a little cross-eyed and wonder where, what bar you came out of. I don't know, but you wouldn't think so. But there's several ways to monetize the TIF. I mean, you can, if you have a well-capitalized organization, you can use your own capital. And basically what it says, you put the investment in up front, and you get the TIF stream and keep it. We're looking at in a number of places philanthropy, government funding in the form of grants, or real soft, no interest loans. Looking at foundations and possibility of program-related investments. And then you have the CDFIs, community development funds, and community lending organizations, which most large banks have, that will actually talk to you about, discounting a TIF. The community lending part of the thing that's exactly what they do, is unconventional lending for projects like this. When you discount when you monetize the TIF, it's basically you get a discounted value, and the amount of cash received is basically based on how long your TIF is and your interest rates. The lender, no matter who it is going to be looking at not just doing it as a math problem, but they're going to look at the organization. What's the strength of the organization? What kind of track record do they have in doing this? And are they going to be there if there's a hiccup? And then, like I said, you got the other ones. But when you look at this monetization process, the general rule is that the shorter the capture period and the lower the interest rate, the more cash you'll get versus the gross amount of that TIF. Unfortunately, the reverse is true. And we're dealing with, in most cases with a CLT model, you're dealing with a 30-year TIF, and the interest rate is up to your borrower. So that's just a law of finance more than anything. So what I did was kind of borrowed some of Danny's money, or borrowed some of Danny. That's a good example, and said, okay, what happens? We're gonna sit there and discount this TIF over a 30-year period and see what it's worth. And this is using again, Traverse City's 31 mills that are capturable. You see in the chart, and it's 30 years in the chart. If you can get somebody to loan you the $1.7 million that you need, your TIF is actually greater than that. And so you could put money in your pocket if they'd loan it to you at 0 interest. Even at 1%, you can put money in your pocket. Once you get up around 3%, it starts, you got to start looking elsewhere for additional funds. And at 5%, you can see we need a lot of additional funds to make it work. Those are, basically following through on the TIF financing. It's not a real complicated transaction, but if I went into it in detail, I'd bore you to death, and I won't do that. So the other thing Danny said that I would be talking about is a little more information and into the weeds a little more on this whole idea of shared appreciation. The typical formula for a CLT is that the home buyer gets 25% of the appreciation when the property is sold, along with its equity. And it's basically a normal fee simple appraisal. What you get an appraisal when you buy the house, you get appraisal when you sell the house. The increase in value is the appreciation, and the homeowner gets that plus any other equity buildup he has in it. And this is an example, again, using 3 different annual appreciation rates at 3%, 4%, and 5%. We started out with our original value of $250. This is, by the way, this is sale in year 7. And you can see the amount of appreciation that comes out and the total appreciation. Those are pretty nice numbers, and but I'm going to show you what has to happen with it. seller's portion of the purchase price or the appreciation is based on this formula. This is what happens. The purchase price of the home was $188,000. 7 years out, the mortgage balance is $159,000. That gives him $29,000 worth of equity that he's built in the house. 25% of the appreciation or above numbers is $12,000 with some rounding. So at the end of the 7-year period, the CLT improvement owner gets $41,000, $46,000, and $50,000. Again, depending on your appreciation rate and a number of other factors. You notice,
George,
yes?
Can I interrupt you just a second? I know Emily got a message in the chat that she's got another call she's got to jump on at 3. Can we interrupt you for just a second to let Emily talk a little bit about the State Land Bank, and then we'll come right back to you. Thanks, thanks, George. Emily.
Yeah, thanks, and I'll be very brief. I think, again, my name's Emily Dorr. I'm the Executive Director of the State Land Bank here in Michigan, and we are very, very pleased to continue talking to local communities and local developers about this tool. And I think I just wanted to reiterate the success that we've seen around the state with there are projects in rural counties like Newaygo that have been able to use this, as well as more urban places, the city of Grand Haven, the city of Flint. So we have seen this in both urban and rural. And the key component that I just wanted to make sure I said as coming to you, I guess, as from state government is, and this might sound a little funny, is that this is not actually something that we would then encourage the state part of the Brownfield TIF capture. And so as you are listening to George and looking through his numbers, I just want to reiterate that when local communities and local developers are working on this with local communities, that the numbers reflected in the amount that you can capture is a local only capture. So again, and I say that it's a local only versus going after then the additional state dollars that would then be decided by state government, specifically the Michigan Strategic Fund with MEDC. We are not encouraging that because at this point, just with policy guidance and precedent, we're not there yet. So again, I just wanted to reiterate that we are the land bank partner. There are for the 39 counties in the state of Michigan that don't have county land banks. So 83 counties in Michigan, 44 have county land banks. This is something that you could do in partnership with your county land bank. And again, have a local only TIF capture. And then the 39 counties that don't have county land banks, you can work with us. We are a state agency, but we would serve with the local community to be able to partner on a project in those 39 communities, those 39 counties. So I just wanted to make sure I said hi. Thank you again, Denny and Yarrow, for bringing me on. My apologies, George, to interrupt you, and I do appreciate it. This wonderful conversation. We really truly feel that TIF is a great way to bring public dollars in for attainable housing up front, and community land trusts are the way to then take that public investment and bring keep it in perpetuity for the sake of that affordable, attainable housing. So thank you again, everyone, for having me. Sorry I have to leave.
Thanks, Emily. And actually, thank you for mentioning the tax thing. I'm going to back up a little bit on the tax rate, et cetera. According to the Michigan Tax Commission, a CLT home will be assessed the same way that a regular home will be assessed. So if you have two homes and sitting side by side that are identical with each other, they're going to have the same assessed value. And under the CLT lease, the landowner is required to, the improvement owner is required to pay the taxes on the land. When we looked at this model, we were getting some pushback from the MEDC on using strategic or state tax credit or state tax millage basically the school millage, 24 mills. And we started looking at it and saying, well, you know, it really doesn't make sense to go after that. Like Denny says, these are personal residents. So to start with, your 24 mills of school taxes, 18 of it is exempt because it's your principal resident. So that leaves 6. If you went after the 6, outside of a real large amount of paperwork you'd have to deal with, you even have to give up half of that back to the MEDC for an administration fee. So you'd be talking about 3 mills, 3 additional mills you could collect. And we made the determination that on a practical basis for the cost and time that it takes to go to the MEDC to get that money, the chances of them improving it, and quite truthfully, the social aspect of it, you know, you're going to build houses, you're going to bring our residents in, you're going to bring more kids to the school district. You're not touching the school taxes. There's also a really strange thing that happens with CLTs. We talked about the fact that we have really 2 pieces of property here. We have the improvements and we have the land. The land is leased by the Community Land Trust to the owner of the improvements. So the improvements are personal residents, so they qualify for the personal residence exemptions. The land is leased property and is not considered personal residence property. And so the land itself is taxed at the full ad valorem tax rate, which in this case is my 31 mills plus 24 mills for the school, or 55 mills. So my little example where you set 2 houses side by side that are absolutely identical in every aspect, the houses will have an assessed value that is equal to each other, or should have, but the CLT house will actually pay more property taxes than the conventional house will, finance house. It's just one of those, and it's one of those things that's in our tax code that, you know, as Denny said, these haven't been popular in the in Michigan. There's like 5 of them, and a whole bunch of them that are upstarts right now. But you know, the tax laws are old. This is a new concept, so we got to live with the old concept.
Yeah, I would add to what George says. There is actually, and I think Larry mentioned it in the chat, there is some legislative activity going on to plan for not getting rid of the tax necessarily, but creating a homeowner credit, an income tax credit to the homeowner, so that the Brownfield TIF and everything could stay in place and still do what it needs to do, but the homeowner would not be then saddled with that extra cost. So that's in the works right now. If you want to know more about that, I know there's a group that's growing, and they're actually looking, I think they're looking for some they have a Democratic, they have bill drafts, and they have a Democratic sponsor. They're looking for, I believe, a senator up in Traverse City. I think they're having conversations with about Republican co-sponsors. So if you want more information about that, we can put you in touch with people who are working on that.
One of the things we did in helping draft that legislation that Denny's talking about, it would be a refundable tax credit to the improvement owner coming directly from the state. By having it that way, we can reduce or increase the amount of money that the landowner or the improvement owner has to pay mortgage payments, which makes him able to afford this house even better. We also set it up as a tax credit to the individual, because if we would accomplish the same thing probably if we gave a CLT home some form of tax abatement, but given a CLT home a tax abatement with the Brownfield TIF, would eliminate the TIF because there would be no new taxes. So that's literally why we took the approach of the refundable tax credit to the individual, not a tax abatement. Okay, can everybody still see my screen? Okay, let me see if I can get it. But anyway, I've kind of put this together. Then he's got close to the same numbers in his presentation. I think he used 6% appreciation. I didn't. Maybe that's my accounting background. I don't know. Those are the numbers and what it looks like for the homeowner. That's important, but what I wanted to show you is we're giving the homeowner 25% of the appreciation, the sharing. There's 75% less left. And the next thing I want to talk about is what do we do with that 75% that comes in here? It's kind of easy, kind of weird too, all right? If you look at the whole CLT model of saying, I bought my home at a 25% discount. I'm going to sell my home. I'm going to get my share of the appreciation. The CLT is going to facilitate a resale of the home to a new buyer at 75% of the appreciation. So what actually happens when they do that, they have to take part of the appreciation they have and invest it back into the discount. And the discount, using the 3%, the new discount on the new purchase price of the home is 75 grand. The old discount was 63 grand. That means 12 grand's got to come from someplace. There's 12 grand missing in the formula. And so that's part of what the CLT has to do with the its share of the appreciation. To make it work, the CLT has to reinvest basically another 25%, because that's what it is, back into the CLT discount. But it's money that has been, that's there. It's not money you got to go beat on the doors to find the 12 grand. So this is kind of where it goes. You start with 49,000, and again, excuse my rounding. The homeowner gets 12. You need the 12 to increase the CLT discount. That leaves basically 25 grand. In our example of the 20 homes, 500 grand total of appreciation that is the CLTs. Now the CLT can do pretty much what it wants as long as it's within their charitable purpose. But some of the more common uses of that 25 grand is, number one and foremost is making repairs or betterments to the CLT home itself, or maybe the portfolio. You have a community that needs some new playground equipment or playground equipment to begin with. You sell a couple of homes 7 years down the road, you can take that money and use it to do that playground equipment. You can use that money to spruce up the home. Any home that's been around for 7 years has got some wear and tear. That's to be expected. You're buying a used piece of property. You can use part of that money to fix that piece of property. One of the ones that Denny showed you is you can also use it to discount the next CLT buyer below the 25 or more than 25%. If you have another $25,000 you can reduce your sales price for, you can drop that sales price lower and lower, or you can use it to build additional CLT housing. It's kind of interesting. We were playing around with some models of what happens, if we were actually looking 60 years out and taking all these TIFs and everything else and putting it in. And it's really amazing. You start with 20 homes. And I think what we figure out that we have 42 homes at the end by taking all this stuff that comes out of here. You wind up and you can build 12 more homes. Then you have all this stuff coming from 42 homes, and it just multiplies itself. You have to remember, though, the original TIF drops off after 30 years. So some parting comments. The combination of the Brownfield Authority and the state or local land bank is a very useful tool. It works. As Emily said, it's being applied in several projects. We're we're putting, I don't know how many of them together right now, but a number of them. Many counties have land banks. I forget what Emily said, 39 counties have land banks. Yeah, okay, there's 44 that don't. If your county doesn't have a land bank, the state land bank will step in and help you with this. We've done several transactions, voluntary transactions like that with the land bank. As a government agency, I must say they're very easy to work with. So Emily and Jim and their crew are very, very much dedicated to helping people develop workforce housing using the land banks and the brownfield authorities. Not all communities have or counties have brownfield authorities. This is a real problem if your municipality doesn't have one or your county doesn't have one and your county doesn't have one. Then you're gonna jump back a little bit to the starting point and convince them that they really, either the county or the local government, need to form a brownfield redevelopment authority. The nice part about it is they don't have to use it just for this. They can use it for other environmental and economic tools for other projects other than just affordable homeownership program. My example shows that, yeah, see, we're capturing 100% of the non-school taxes, and it allows us to capture it for 30 years. It's not always the case, the 30 years. Many jurisdictions will say, we're only going to give you a TIF for 12 years. That's based on some other tax exemption legislation that people equate the two with. I don't know if anybody's on here from Ludington, but Ludington basically will only give you half the millage. So instead of collecting all the millage, you can only collect half of it. And I think they're maybe at 15 years. I'm not sure. I'm working with them right now. I should know. But anyway, this is where I guess having public advocacy and local people working with their local government, because to get this thing to go, to make this thing work, you have to have that brownfield authority to say yes. And that's controlled at the community level. Typically on other projects that brownfield authorities have been used for, there hasn't been a lot of pushback on doing that, because it's basically the municipality and the taxing authorities are keeping the same tax that they had. We're just capturing the incremental increase in it. And by only going for the non-school taxes, we're not hurting school funding, which probably be most impacted by the TIF, because there'll be more kids. And you know, if you know how the state funding program, you know, the more kids they have, the more money they have in schools. So it works out pretty well. And then when you're looking at these TIF, don't overlook the idea of what you are going to use those sale proceeds with. Dwelling places CLT, I think, lays out 4 or 5 different things as their goals. They can do anything they want with it within their charitable purpose. Their goals are, number one, make sure the property itself is up to date, community is up to date. Then I think the second one is, or second or third one is that using it to discount the proceeds or the sale price of future homes by more. But over time, and Denny said these homes sell on national average every 7 years. You start building homes in this thing, and pretty soon this becomes almost an annual thing where you're going to have a certain number of these homes turn over. So that is an interesting source of income for you. That's pretty much all I have. Probably going to wind up with more questions, and
George, I'm going to make a couple of just final comments about that before we turn it over to Larry for questions. I know we have about 15 or 20 minutes left, but George, what I'm really kind of a takeaway on this thing, you got to have a Brownfield authority. You got to have a land bank. You got to have a Brownfield authority that's willing to look out the longer period of time, 30 years. If they don't, you're going to have a bigger gap. You've got to have a capital subsidy source. So that can come from philanthropy, it can come from public funding. Every community right now is getting ARPA dollars out there. There are, in the final ARPA rules, you can get some stuff up Grounded Solutions and Center for Community Change. There's provisions within ARPA that would allow this kind of development to happen and to be supported with ARPA funds from your community, from the state. So all those are essential ingredients of the things. And the other essential ingredient is the capacity of a CLT to be able to maintain itself. We think it takes about 150 units to get to sustainability for a CLT. So on the way there, you need, if you're a brand new CLT, you need to find a bigger partner who has infrastructure, staffing capacity, and financial capacity to work with in collaboration until you get to that point. So those are big takeaways on this thing. It isn't for everybody, and it's not a panacea, but it can be done if there's a will and a way. And I know in Traverse City, as in many other areas where there's a resort community, the economic impact of doing nothing is going to be really stifling for that region and that area if you don't look at something like this. So if there's enough willpower up there to do that, if there's enough willpower in any community to do this, and the Brownfield authorities, the land banks are willing to work on this, this is what you could. This is a strategy that can be done. It's being done, and we're happy to help in any way we can to help support that. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, one other thing that I'd like to point out is, you might get some political pushback with the for-profit developers that, you're cutting into their market. The typical CLT is serving people that have family incomes at or below 110% of area median incomes. The IRS wants a target of 80, an average of 80% for safe harbor. So in most cases, these are people that wouldn't be able to, knock on a developer's door and have a house built for them. These are people that are, and I've looked at it, and I know Denny's because we've looked at it together. These are people that are coming out of rentals. This can be their first step out of rentals and be served. Okay, Larry, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. We have a plethora of questions that have come in both in the Q&A and in the chat. And I sort of divided them into 3 groups. I think I'll ask Denny the questions that I think he's best able to answer, but please, George or Yarrow, don't hesitate to jump in if Denny stumbles or needs.
I was just going to ask George to end his show maybe, and then we can, they can see all your faces.
Okay. Oh, stop sharing that button.
That's okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Danny, two really interesting questions that came in very early. One was, how can CLTs improve the quality of housing? This questioner says they have pretty affordable housing, but our issue is generally of poor quality. So
that's a very good question. When I was at Dwelling Place for 30 years, we didn't do anything that in development. It was a choice we made that quality was going to be a major component, even if we couldn't do it. In the end, we couldn't do it because it was going to cost us too much money. We were not going to do anything less than that. When I first came to work at Dwelling Place, we had a lot of I call them, we were benevolent slumlords, I guess is what I would say, and we changed that over time to the point where people would walk in and say, this is low income housing. So I think it's really, really important that every community decide what those standards you want to see are. And that's going to drive the cost of the whole thing. I mean, a $250,000, as in the scenario we were talking about for a 1,200 square foot home, the numbers may be different in this weird time we're in, maybe a little higher, but you want to make sure it's designed well, that the community, it's something the community can accept and sure we're going to be very, very proud of over time and that will last long. There's groups doing net zero homes in CLTs. Michael Brown, I mentioned, is actually retiring too as a consultant and doing a 64 unit project in Bozeman, Montana, that is going to be CLT with net zero homes in it. And with a lot of cooperation from the city of Bozeman and others in that area too, to do that. So that's up to the community to decide what you want to do. I would never encourage anyone to do something because that's all you can afford to do. That's a mistake.
Denny, and Mike, I got a little bit to add to that. It's probably not the preferable way to start out with CLT. You need to, we were actually looking at this question at the Dwelling Place CLT board meeting today is, which way do you go? Dwelling Place is looking at scattered site. They're looking at rental conversions. They're looking at, new ground up properties. I'm not going to go in detail, but you can actually use this TIF to help acquire that house and fix it up and literally sell it back to the person you bought it from under the TIF scenario. I'm not going to go into those details, but you can do it legally and effectively, and it works. My only caution is that I would suggest you work on developing a new pool of homes before you take on that type of a project. It's a little different.
Okay, thank you. Again, Danny, and I think we know the answer to this one, but we'll let you give it. The questioner says, when I've discussed the idea of land trusts, the common question is how much capital or money does it take to start a CLT? What's an appropriate answer?
Well, that's a very good question too. And I mentioned this is a difficult thing to start up. Dwelling Place, we spent 2 years planning to start one. Okay, first of all, and Dwelling Place has quite a bit of capacity, quite a bit of resources to do it. But we after working with national consultants and others, looked at a 7-year to 10-year time frame to get to 150 units. But we knew we weren't going to get that one house at a time. That's why this kind of model was really important. Why I asked George about doing something because if you can do 3 or 4, 20-unit projects over a period of several years, you get to scale quicker. So I think there's 2 questions in here. One is to reach sustainability for a CLT, and that's what I was trying to address initially here, is we actually created a $250,000 operating reserve at Dwelling Place to cover some of the staff costs and all that in there, and then a $450,000 capital reserve in case we ended up in a situation where we needed to buy a unit back or something like that because we didn't want to lose the equity that we'd given away essentially in a foreclosure. So we did that, but I'm going to guess it's probably even more than that over that period of time, which is why I've referenced collaboration as a really important thing. Dwelling Place did not have, for example, a HUD certified counseling agency organization inside. It would cost us a lot of money to get up to speed on that and staffing costs. So instead, we went out and reached out to those that were like Michigan Habitat has a fantastic, that works anywhere in the state to do this. ICCF in Grand Rapids has a HUD certified counseling agency. So collaboration's got to be a key part of this in startup. On the other piece of it though, the development side, the capital subsidy, and that's where we really got to start having conversations with those policymakers in the communities that are deciding about what to do with ARPA, with home funds, and philanthropic groups. I'm actually starting to make contacts with national foundations right now on that question of their role in CLTs. There's at least 5 that are doing work in CLTs on the national level right now.
And don't forget on a local level working with your officials to get the Brownfield Authority to approve a 30-year TIF.
Yeah.
Because even if you have to take it and pay high interest rates on the loan, it's going to cover 2/3 of your gap. That's what it does.
Yep. Thank you. George, a couple of really easy questions for you. Not really. Is there an opportunity cost for prospective investors? So the question is TIF revenue less profitable than market rate business?
Well,
I've even started.
I guess what I should have mentioned before is, as a rule of thumb, you should look at a funding gap of somewhere around $90,000 to $110,000. So I guess the answer to the question is it takes the same amount of money to develop a market rate house as it does a same CLT house, except you're getting $100,000 less. It's hard to find an opportunity unless you're, I guess, looking for an opportunity to lose money. One of the things that we did and have looked at in the model, though, is, remember my little chart, I had that 0 interest rate on discounting, and that covered my entire gap. In some communities approaching that have, these are generally smaller communities, a dominant employer that has, manufacturer or whatnot, that has a terrible need for employees, and go to them and say, we can build housing for 20 of your employees if you give us a no interest loan for 20 years. And by the way, we'll give you the money back through the TIF. So you're not asking them to give you the $2 million. You're just asking them to loan you a couple $1 million for 20 years so you can help cure his employment problem. Because I think we all know that because of housing costs, employees are being forced left and right to get further and further away from work.
I think the question was really in conjunction with your talking about approaching a funding source to buy the TIF income stream. Mm-hmm. So that's a different kind of investor that would buy that discounted stream.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't include every source in the world on that. Different people, and Denny and I have working together for a number of years. I mean, we've had people loan dwelling place money for a particular project interest free for a while. And that type of thing, or at a way below market rate interest. Mm-hmm. And then one of the problems that you have, if you look at the more conventional community banks, CDFIs, that would be the normal target for funding this, and on maybe a little more equitable basis, typically they only go out for 10 years. And so at the end of 10 years, you got to refinance that TIF stream. Now it should be easier because the TIF stream's now mature. So, refinancing would probably be fairly easy. But the other thing is you could use a benevolent lender to say, how would you like to make 3.5% on your money for the next 30 years?
Larry, I also think that that's why it's so important to connect CLTs with all the other economic development issues going on in your community and the stresses and strains, because doing something like this, housing is really a tool in economic development. And for those who might say, I got to decide where to give. Am I going to give to housing? Am I going to give to this other investment or this and whatever? Is to looking at the impact on the community where you live. And so folks, whether it's a foundation, a personal foundation, or a family foundation, or a corporate foundation, or an employer, like George said, it's really looking at, is it worth it for me to come in with a fairly low expectation in terms of rate of return? I'm going to get it back, but the fairly low rate of return for all the things that it can do in changing the dynamics and the economics in my community. That's really what you got to ask yourself.
Cool. I'm going to save the couple that I think are for Yarrow till the end, because she's going to want to wind up things. So let me get back to Danny. Here's 3 questions that were very early on. And I think that one of them is probably answered. But with the CLT model where the CLT owns the land and the home is sold and the lease and the land leased to the homeowner, how is ongoing care and maintenance verified? Let's do that one first.
Well, again, every CLT is going to be a little different in this regard. Mm-hmm. The ones, I mean, if you're leaning towards don't get in their way, they're homeowners, don't bother them, then you probably wouldn't have a heavy touch on monitoring compliance in those areas unless you see something happening or you're observing something as you're driving by or whatever that's going on in there. There are others who may be more engaged directly with the homeowners in different ways. And as I said earlier, not paying the lease plan payment is usually a canary in the coal mine notification that there's some other problems going on here. But I think there's a number of ways. I'm not familiar with all of them, what they all would be, but I think there's not one size fits all. I think it's really going to be formed by what your expectations are in the community. That might actually be a question for, I think our only CLT operator here in the call was Northern Homes, but it'll vary.
Larry, Denny used some numbers showing the differential on foreclosures and troubled properties between CLTs and everything else. If you drill down on that and look at, why is that? Came real quick to 2 different rules. Number one, your house is based, your initial purchase is based on 25% of the fair market value of the home at the date of purchase. So your house, in theory, can depreciate by 25% before you're in deep trouble. But the other end of that, that's one thing. But the big thing was this stewardship program Denny talked about, being involved in the homeowners, the canary in the coal mine. You start missing land lease payments, and you're going to real quickly notice that somebody's got some problems. And the CLTs were able to step in when they started seeing these problems and help the people work through the problems. And there's, there's hundreds of examples on how they could do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to answer the 2 other questions that were early, one of which was answered by panelists, and that is, does the homeowner pay the full property taxes assessed? And the answer is yes. And then the other question, again, this was very early on in the session. What is the geographical area determined for a CLT? Is it a city, entire county, just a neighborhood? And the answer is it can be any of those.
Absolutely. Yep, it could be any of those.
It's what works.
Yeah. One of the things you might want to think about, though, is that in a rural area, especially, you might want to not think about having a CLT in every town. You might want to look at more of a regional approach, and even in urban areas doing that too. I mean, that's why Dwelling Place formed a regional CLT that covers 15 counties or something, is because then they could work in other communities and work, even as other CLTs are developing. But because it's so much work. It's so much work to do it.
Yeah. The other thing, Larry, is on that one, it's kind of interesting. It's a blessing and a curse. Typically, incorporated cities and villages have higher millages, local millage, than a township. And so the higher your millage, the more your TIF is worth. And so, and it also has a bearing on local, like in Grand Rapids, the millage rate that we can capture is 24 mills, and it's 31 in Traverse City. When I started doing my numbers, I was a little shocked, saying, what caused this? And I found out that the big gap difference between Grand Rapids and Traverse City, where basically that 6 mills or 7 mills extra got it down. That's the good news. The bad news is those taxes are figured in the affordability of the house by the mortgage company. And so the homeowner can borrow less. So you have, in theory, have more money to build a place, you have less money to sell it. So, like I said, it's a benefit and a curse. So,
George, this is we're almost at the end of the questions, but this is a really technical one. Cities, this is from the chat. Cities can enact a brownfield TIF for infrastructure, but not land purchases. Is it true that only a land bank can use a brownfield TIF for land purchases?
Yes.
Okay, sweet. And then Denny, this is a delicate subject, I think. Can lease stipulations be used in CLT homes to target particular populations like people with disabilities?
That's a good question. We, and Dave DeVelder's on this call, I think, from Dwelling Place, and he could do the whole history on that in terms of protected classes. It's one of those things where you say, well, we want to deal with racial equity, we want to deal with people with disabilities. Can we go ahead and make this only for those people, only for African Americans, or only for this? My advice to you in all of this is talk to your fair housing centers about these things. Talk to your attorneys about this thing. Look at what the law says, Michigan law, local laws and ordinances about that, because the answers, and the interpretation on those answers, most of the time, the answer is in how well you do outreach. If you really want to target a particular population, make sure your outreach plan to find candidates and get them pre-qualified is really targeting on that population, as opposed to saying to someone, well, you don't have a disability, so you can't be here. Now, in rental housing, they have special provisions and exemptions under fair housing for disabilities. They don't on race. So I think that's the point, I guess, is to make sure you confer with experts at the local and state level around fair housing laws. Don't go into this thinking you can do something. I've seen that happen before, and you get in trouble.
Yeah. The other thing is with some of the non-protected classes within the CLT, you can set up preferences. So, if you have two buyers and one of them is in your preference category, that buyer should win out over the one that's not. But those preferences have to be very strictly.
Yeah, I wouldn't say for sure that on protected classes you can create preferences. I think on other things like artists, we want to see, if you're doing a condo with art things.
No, I don't think you can with protected.
No, you can't do
non-protected classes.
Yeah. So
like Denny said, artists or people that works for XYZ Corporation.
Exactly.
That gave you the $2 million tax interest free, those fees. So.
Talk to your lawyers, talk to your fair housing center. Okay.
And hopefully a lawyer has a lot of fair housing experience, because it's bad.
Okay. We've got two more that came in the Q&A here. This is a compelling question for probably both of you guys. How do lenders decide on how much to lend when the purchase is 75% of the appraised value? Don't lenders look at a lower buyer cost versus appraisal?
You're onto something here, though. But Fannie, Freddie, Rural Housing Authority, there are, those are the people in the secondary market. And the way their guidelines work is because the CLT land lease is subordinated to the mortgage, the equity that the CLT is leaving in there becomes part, for all intents and purposes, for their purposes, a down payment. But one of the things they do is kind of weird. They say, okay, here's the fee interest, the fee value of the home. From that value, you have to subtract the value of the land under their formula. And so it gives you a net value, and they'll loan you 80% of that value. So if your 75% of sales price is higher than that, somebody's going to have to come up with some dollars. But there are formulas out there that the secondary market has, and there's riders that answers that question. It's very cut and dry how they do it.
Yeah, there's, in fact, in the lending area, there are a number of banks that have experience in Michigan with doing this kind of lending, and some CDFIs as well with this kind of special lending. There are, as George said, there's a Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac waivers for mortgage lending, but there are not only does the mortgage have to comply, but the CLT organization has to meet certain requirements as well in terms of making a lending CLT lending. So there's a lot of requirements in there. One good thing though is that in many cases, mortgage insurance costs go away because of the high loan to value ratio. The loan to value ratios are so good. It can, in many cases, eliminate the need for mortgage insurance for the buyer. So that's a savings too.
Cool.
Yeah.
Here. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, never mind. No, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Here's a hypothetical question. As some appreciation exists, is there a point where a CLT is unaffordable? And I think the answer is likely no, as long as the CLT can afford to keep discounting the property.
Yeah, I think that's the answer to that question. Is they need to be able, again, if incomes are only going up 1% a year or 2% a year in a community, and properties are going up 6% a year, you're going to eventually have a point where you can't reach that 80% person anymore unless the CLT is willing to take some of that 75% of shared equity and reduce the price.
Yep. Thank you, guys. The last two questions, which I think they're sort of leaders for Yarrow. One is, I just wanted to make sure that Yarrow can note that Grounded Solutions in the chat provided a link to various different approaches for setting the affordable resale price, and that's going to be able to be shared with people. The other question was the homestead exemption concern about the land, the land value that's in the CLT, and the fact that there is some legislation proposed. If you could maybe say anything more about what the status of that is and what anybody can do to facilitate.
I will do my best, and then maybe Denny can chime in. But we are, I believe, looking for a co-sponsor still for one of the bills. I think we're close, but there are, I believe, 2 tracks of the bill we're looking at, and we're working with Dwelling Place, and there's like a small group, I guess, getting together to try to address this. And Kent, our policy advisor, is part of those talks, and I think they're making a lot of headway. But Denny, I don't know if you want to maybe say something about it.
Yeah,
and we don't have a call to action yet, I guess I would say.
Right. I think they're being careful not to get too many chefs in the stew or whatever at this stage in time, trying to get, meetings with Treasury. There've been meetings with Treasury to make sure that any of their worries or concerns are addressed. They're quietly building some bipartisan support for this. Senator Chang, I believe in Detroit, is the Democratic co-sponsor. And I don't know if it was Wayne Schmidt or another senator up your way is who they've been talking to, or we're going to be talking to about getting involved as a Republican co-sponsor. But Stephen Wooden, who works for Dwelling Places staff, has been he used to work in the legislature, so he knows how all the sausage is made. And so he was doing a lot of work behind the scenes on this thing. And there is a summary of the status of it or how it works. And I guess what I would say to Yarrow is maybe check with your group, your small group that wants to not let it all out of the bag yet, but check with them and see if they're at least willing to share on your website or whatever the summary of what's being planned right now or what they're working on. Because I think once there is a call to action, everybody needs to get out and talk to their legislators about this. So.
Yeah, and I guess I would say you can talk about how this is this is a need, I guess, to have the tax situation addressed so that community land trust can be more affordable. And when and if, I think it's probably Wayne Schmidt we're looking to be the sponsor, but I think that if you are in contact with any of your legislators, you can let them know how important this is, I guess, but not specifics maybe because we're not there yet. And I will certainly share that information.
Yeah, and if you have a special relationship with your legislator and you want George or myself or somebody from whatever to come talk to him about the legislation, Steve Wood and whoever, I'm sure folks are willing to do this. The more legislators that understand what a CLT is and what this does. I mean, most people will say, you know what, it's unfair that someone, a low-income home buyer, has to pay ad valorem taxes on land, you know, just because they're in a CLT structure. And most people will get that.
Yeah, I should say that I'm part of that group. I'm on the call that happens every couple, 3 weeks. And we're going to be having a call again later this month. And so Yarrow will know, and I'm as things develop, and can let everybody know through her media.
Yes. And so just to wrap up, you know, I know we want to be sensitive to everybody's time. We'll send a follow-up email with some links and information. If any questions for some reason didn't get answered, you can reach out to me. And then we do have a link now on our website specifically for community land trust information. So Larry is a resource. All these, you know, we're all resources for you. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Yeah, Yarrow, somebody, Rick Ballard came into the chat and wanted to know about the PowerPoints. You know, please feel free to let people use it. Nobody can change any of the numbers, but.
Okay. Well, what we'll do is probably email those out to the registered attendees as a PowerPoint. And then, yeah, we'll share all the information that we can. So thank you. You know, everybody, this is recorded. If you don't know that we have a YouTube channel, you can always go onto the Housing North YouTube channel to see our recorded webinars. And we will be in touch tomorrow. If you can join the land bank webinar at 9:30, but I know other communities will be bringing these same type of talks, you know, to your groups too. So look out for those in the future.
Especially if you're looking to drill down a little more on the land bank's role in the TIF and everything, Jim Tischler knows it inside and out and can get real technical on you.
Yeah, and I'll just close to say that we do have 3 counties in our region that do not have land banks. And so if you do want to learn, you know, more about how that work can happen too, we'd be happy to connect you with some consultants and other experts to start doing that work. So thank you again to George, to Denny, to Larry. And I forgot to run my poll for more information because I just totally forgot. So I think what I'll do is I'll share that poll with the registered attendees. And then hopefully we'll get some feedback to plan for the next workshop. So thank you again. And I'm gonna say goodbye. All right, take care, everybody.
Take care, everybody.